안녕하십니까? Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sungeun Baek, the president of Korean Educational Development Institute. It is a great honor and privilege to be here as a moderator at this session 4, track D, preparing for the future through innovation. In this session, we have two distinguished speakers. Each speaker will present about 35 minutes. After two presentations, we will have a 20 minutes Q&A session. If you have any questions on their presentations, please write down your questions on the paper, like question sheet on your table, and submit in the front step. Then, let's start the first presentations. Our first speaker is Dr. Milton Chen. He is a senior fellow and executive director Emeritus, George Lucas Educational Foundation. He will give us a well-prepared presentation. The title of his presentation is 6 Leading Edges of Innovation in Our Schools. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Chen with a big hand.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to the last session of the conference. I will talk about leading edges of innovation in our schools and try to connect these ideas of ways in which we can improve our school systems to Michael's remarks about global talent. Just quickly, I mentioned yesterday in my talk that I've been very fortunate in my own life. My learning journey has taken me from the longest street in the world, which is Sesame Street, which has circled the globe with international versions in the Middle East, in Arabic, in Hebrew, South Africa, Asia as well, Latin America. I've also been very fortunate to work for George Lucas at his educational foundation in California, in the Bay Area. So I've gone from the longest street in the world to a galaxy long ago and far, far away. I'm glad that galaxy will be coming to a theater near you in December. I've been very fortunate, and in the last decade of my career, I'm trying to do more to encourage, as this slide suggests, more exchange between the US and China and Asia. It's been said that this century is Asia's century, and I do believe that Asia and the West need to find more ways to collaborate and exchange, beginning with our students, that this will be our best hope for prosperity and peace in this century. Our website is edutopia.org. From that name, you can tell we have in mind a more ideal learning environment, an educational utopia where students can work together in teams, do projects that relate to their own lives and their own families and communities, and also begin to learn about the rest of the world. Global learning, you'll see a lot of content on our site about global education and ways in which students, we have focused primarily on American students, are learning a language and culture, connecting through the internet with the rest of the world. I like to say the internet makes learning international. It's the tool we need to connect up this world and students in different countries. Just one example of students learning Chinese in my hometown of Chicago. Chicago, ironically, in the middle of the US, has one of the largest Chinese teaching programs because they had vision from their superintendent of schools and their mayor that to truly become a global city, they needed to reach out and teach more foreign language. So here's a film from our website. Please check it out if you'd like, from the Walter Payton High School, where students are learning not only foreign language and culture, but also STEM. So I like schools that don't think about themselves as either or. We're a STEM school, science, technology, engineering, and math, or we're a global learning school, politics, government, culture, history, foreign language, but both and. I think that's also part of a 21st century skill set, is to find ways to connect across silos. So Walter Payton High School is one that thinks about itself as a STEM school and a world culture school. On our website, you'll see lots of examples from other countries, in part through a partnership with the Pearson Foundation, schools in Singapore, Ontario. I hope someday we'll have some schools from Korea featured as well. Please let us know. I was hearing from Dr. Baek the educational innovations happening in this country. Please let us know your suggestions for the most innovative Korean schools. I like to point to this idea in an education nation, as I like to talk about it. How would you know if you had an education nation? And there are many things about the Korean educational system, as I've been learning about it, that suggest you're becoming an education nation. And when education truly rises to the top of a nation's agenda, you begin to see things like this from Singapore and Taiwan. Imagine that conversation at the highest levels of Singapore and Taiwan, the chance to create a new currency. What images would you put on that currency to show what your nation represents? And in at least those two countries, they put images of children learning. I will say for the United States, we're a long way from this if you look at our currency and what we have on our dollars. I wrote a book based on our work at the Lucas Educational Foundation and the Edutopia website. I tried to organize our work into 6 edges of innovation, which I'll talk about today. And very grateful that my book has been translated in Korean as well. So here are the edges of innovation I like to talk about. And here are the organizing principles for many innovative schools at the Edutopia website. The first edge is the thinking edge, and probably the most important edge. If we can change our thinking about what is now possible in schools, out of school learning, then the rest of the edges will come along. But changing our thinking has been the most difficult thing. There will be changes in curriculum and assessment, moving away from textbook-based curricula to project-based curricula, moving away from tests that emphasize memorization to performance-based assessment, where students have to do something to show what they know. The use of technology, obviously an important edge, an edge that's moving from being an edge to the center of teaching and learning. The edge of time and place, finding more learning time in different learning places. So learning can happen outside of the school. In the US, one of the bright spots in the educational system in the US is after school and summer learning. So because we have had a testing regime that tests only math and English, we forced out science in many schools, we forced out the arts. So often students receive the arts and the sciences after school, between the hours of 3 and 6 p.m., and also during the summer. Another fifth edge, co-teaching and co-learning. In this century, all of us can be teachers and all of us should be learners. Lifelong learning for everyone. This is true of students as well. Students can be teachers, can be peer teachers and tutors for each other. We were saying in an earlier session, there's great benefit we're learning when students can talk about how they understand concepts with each other. Sometimes they can learn more from each other than they can from the way in which the faculty member, the teacher, presents the information. Co-teaching and co-learning, and that last edge, young people who are the largest edge, the largest group of stakeholders in education, but rarely asked for their opinions about what school should be like. So in the US, we're trying to encourage more youth voice, as we call it, more youth choice, as we call it, and making room for students to, in fact, design their own learning. And I'll talk about these examples. So I think you're very familiar with the notion of learning anytime, any place. You can get information as I'm speaking. You can look up some of these websites. I'll talk about anytime, any place. But this is also leading towards learning any path, any pace. Varying the time, the pacing of instruction. When students need more time, we can expand the time. When they learn more quickly, we can compress the time. Also learning through multiple pathways, different ways of connecting up subject areas, integrating between STEM and history and language arts, as I mentioned. If a student, and I'll give you one example, I'll just use George Lucas as one example. If you'd asked Mr. Lucas in high school what he was interested in and why he wasn't getting good grades, he would have said, I'm interested in 2 things, cars and photography. But back then in the 1960s, those interests were never anything you could use in school. Today, good teachers find ways to create pathways for students. If you come in with an interest in something, they can connect up mathematics to art and animation. I'm just thinking that Mr. Lucas, the one indication of who he is today as a filmmaker is he did have a dark room at home to do photography. But many of the young people in this audience will not even know what a dark room is. It's a little hard to explain. A dark room is well, it's a room that was very dark, and this is where you went to develop photographs. It was very messy and took a long time. It's amazing that we lived through that era, but that's how you did photography 50 years ago. As I mentioned, this is America's strength. Even though we have huge achievement gaps between our very best students and our poorest students, a larger gap than you will find in this country and most other countries. Andreas Schleicher is very good at making this case that the very best American schools are as good as any other country, but we have a lot of really poor schools with teachers who don't know their subjects very well. In many schools, we don't even have a physics teacher. We cannot find physics teachers to teach physics to our students. So the out-of-school world that we have, with the world's greatest, not only some of the best universities, but some of the very best museums, our system of public libraries. Thank you, Andrew Carnegie, for setting up a system for public libraries in the United States. These places are becoming also places of learning for young people. So we can talk about a new day for learning that's not just 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 180 days a year. Another important point about our school system, a very short school year compared to, I understand, 190 days, at least 2 more weeks for Korean students than our students at 180 days. We can talk about a new day for learning, a new learning year, 24/7, 365. And if you were to boil it all down, we're just talking about authentic learning, making sure that school life is more like real life, breaking down the artificiality of schools, and making sure that students always know what they're learning, how it applies to real life. And that includes making sure that when you're in school, you're beginning to get some exposure to the workplace, beginning to understand how the world of work is organized, beginning to think, whether you're 5, 10, 15 years old, about your future careers. Just quickly on the thinking edge, one of the ways we like to change the thinking edge is to think about the whole child. Think about the 8 ways, not just 2 ways, not just the verbal and the mathematical, but the 8 ways: the visual intelligence, the musical intelligence, the bodily kinesthetic intelligence, athletes, dancers who are good with their bodies, intrapersonal intelligence, people who know themselves and their own feelings and emotions well. This is a theory from Howard Gardner at Harvard called multiple intelligences. The interpersonal intelligence. There's been so much talk at this conference about teamwork, cooperation in the workplace. How can we help our workers understand this is a real skill? There's some people who are very intelligent about interpersonal working. You know them, you can tell them right away. They're very good in groups. They're very good at organizing groups, leading groups, communicating respectfully. It's a certain kind of intelligence. And the last intelligence, the naturalist intelligence, people who are good in nature. They're good with plants and animals, a certain kind of skill and becoming increasingly important as we face so many challenges to nature and conservation and climate change. So here's a little cartoon about what happens when we only emphasize 2 of the 8. And here lies Frederick Jones with his verbal and math skills, which were actually pretty good. He probably got into a good college in the United States, but hopefully he was more than just the sum of his test scores. Here's something you can do quickly. If you'd like to do a quick quiz about your own multiple intelligences, go to edutopia.org and just look for the MI quiz, the Multiple Intelligence Quiz. It's 24 quick questions. It asks you what you like to do, what you're good at. It only takes about 5 or 10 minutes, and within 10 minutes you will get a little profile of your multiple intelligences. We like to do this with teachers especially, so that teachers say, yeah, I have certain strengths, I have certain things I like to do, and then other things I'm not so good at. How can I improve the things I'm not so good at and use my strengths in my work? So we work for a filmmaker at the George Lucas Educational Foundation, and one of our strengths as a website, as an organization, is we make films. And when you see these short films, 5 to 8 minute films, very quickly you'll begin to understand what this looks like in the classroom. If I were to say, one of the keys to students learning reading and writing, English language learners from Tucson, Arizona, one of the ways in which they improve their reading and writing is through opera. When I first heard this, I said, well, how does that work? I can't imagine how that works. Opera is something that's very expensive. You go downtown, you buy an expensive ticket, you dress up. It's usually sung in a foreign language, Italian, German. How does that help Latino kids who are still learning English? How does that help them learn English? So in just 4 minutes, I'll show you what this looks like.
These first graders are learning all about opera. And with the help of professional singers and musicians, they're also becoming writers.
How does Papageno feel in the beginning of the story?
Thrilled.
Yeah.
Very good. And then how do they both feel at the end of our song? It means really, really happy. How do they feel?
Exuberant.
Exuberance. Very good.
At Corbett Elementary School in Tucson, Arizona, the arts enhance instruction in math, reading, writing, science, and social studies.
What words do you use when you're at the end of the story?
Finally.
Finally.
The Arts Infusion program, now operating in more than 44 schools, is called OMA, Opening Minds Through the Arts.
Opening Minds Through the Arts is a program that utilizes the arts to boost student achievement and social growth, one that uses those tools in music, writing, visual arts, and dance to make connections for children that are related to their neurological development and to their social growth.
My donkey low, my donkey high, high, low.
OMA is based on brain research showing that the wiring of the left to the right side of the brain takes place between the ages of 4 and 12, a time when children learn from different forms of stimulation.
Is there something that we're making with ourselves that we're forming? Let's see, Esteban.
A pattern.
A pattern. What kind of pattern are we making?
A high-low pattern.
Maybe.
Music helps kindergarten children learn to listen.
Our very first shape today is a triangle. Hand on your hips. 1, 2.
Dance helps second graders learn geometry.
Now put your feet apart so you have a triangle in your legs.
Fourth graders study science while learning the violin.
Okay, how does humidity affect our instrument?
It makes the strings stick to the bridge.
And fifth graders express their creativity by composing music.
So now we need something that repeats. A rhythm that would be here, and then it would repeat here.
Opening Minds to the Arts really is an academic program that infuses the arts. Because we align it with the state standards, it gives another way for the brain to connect to what children are learning. And the more opportunities that children have to have tactile or physical or all of those responses that may be different than what we are used to learning with, the better they learn.
Mein Tür ist verschlossen, ich lass dich nicht ein.
Professional artists from the Tucson Opera, the Symphony, and the University of Arizona teach in each classroom twice a week.
Gute Nacht, gute Nacht, gute Nacht, mein Knab.
We always like to sing things in foreign languages so that it really helps the students to observe, and it puts the second language learners in the same boat as the English-speaking students because it's in a totally different language that no one knows.
Corbett Elementary is a neighborhood school in a working-class section of Tucson. 20% of its students are English language learners.
Like my house is dirty, I have to clean it up.
One of the things that the OMA program does, especially for our English language learners, is provide them with a art form that's connected to learning in a way that they can connect no matter what language they speak.
Does anybody know what this is called when we kind of sing like this? What do we call that in the opera? Recitative. Everybody say recitative.
Recitative.
Get used to it, because this is how we're going to compose music when you write your own opera. Isn't that
The
exciting?
professional artists come in and they just have a wealth of knowledge. But not only do these artists have a firm grasp on their art form, but they're able to come in and create lesson plans that teach these things to the students while also integrating things like language skills and just 21st century skills.
We've learned a lot of things about opera, like subtext and like how terms of opera are used. And you get to use your imagination a lot.
Nice bow in your hair.
It's a really good way of learning because usually when you learn, you just read it out of the textbooks. But when you act out stuff and talk about stuff, it really helps you learn better.
Don't be late. I won't.
I won't.
So then you rush off and you say, good job, dude. Good job. We want the story to be based around some theme from the
So in
curriculum.
the interest of time, I'll move along, but you see what's going on there. In just 5 minutes, you know a lot more about the value of the arts in language arts, in reading and writing. You see the students are using their bodies to express language. That's the key thing. So reading is not just a matter of looking at text on a page. Writing is not just a matter of typing and making words, but through this experience of using your voice, of movement, of story, they become more motivated and more engaged. And they make the point that you need to use your body. The kinesthetic intelligence helps support the verbal intelligence. We're making these connections between the multiple intelligences. I like to say that kids need to come to their senses in their learning. They need to use all of their senses in their learning, the visual, the vocal, the touch. They're working together, the cooperative learning, the teamwork. So you see a lot of these edges of innovation in just that one example. I like to cite this website, the academyofachievement.org. Achievement.org, there's many, many stories of very distinguished individuals telling their life story to students. We had a great session today with some student entrepreneurs. This is what the Academy of Achievement does in Washington, D.C., brings together very distinguished architects, artists, scientists, writers, and has them talk to students. But about 15 years ago, they started to put these interviews online. So if you like, go online. There's hundreds of people there. I'm sure you'll recognize some of their names. But you'll also see that many of them were not very good students when they were in school. Mr. Lucas being one example. I like to cite the example of Frank Gehry, our amazing architect who flunked his first architecture class. So it's very reassuring to students to know that these very famous people were like them, often struggling and often not doing well in school. The curriculum edge I like to talk about is project-based learning instead of textbook-based learning. And here's just one example. If these kids in West Philadelphia can design and build and win competitions for hybrid vehicles, that sets the bar. These students that you see in the back of this photo come from very poor families, but they designed and built this K1 Attack sports car that runs on biodiesel and gets 55 miles per gallon. If they can do this, your students can do this too, and maybe they should be doing this as part of the curriculum. This fellow, Simon Haggar, is their teacher. He has an engineering background. I met him about 5 years ago. I said, Simon, this is great, amazing that you're able to do this with your students. I said, what do you want to do next? You're going to do another project? Simon said, what I want to do is start a school where they just do this all the time. Last summer, I was driving around San Francisco and listening to National Public Radio, and there was a report that started with this sentence, as you see it there. Imagine a school where classes are organized not by subject, but by project. Such a school exists. It's in West Philadelphia. It's called the Workshop School. I said, Simon's done it. That is Simon Haggar's school in Philadelphia, where students just do these projects all the time. If you're interested in further information about project-based learning, please go to the Buck Institute for Education, some of the best resources, and I think translated in Korean and in several languages now. I know the Buck Institute is doing some workshops about PBL in Korea, so more to come about that. Another part of the curriculum we like to talk about is social emotional learning. I know, again, there have been several sessions about this here, character education, teaching children to understand and manage the emotional side of their lives and the emotional side of their learning. If we want students to work together and to model the modern workforce, where they're working together in teams to do something bigger, design a car, very hard to do that on your own. You need a team of people to do that. If we want them to do that, we need to have them be more socially and emotionally intelligent, respectful, able to listen to each other, able to find ways to get creative in a group. So these are skills that can be taught, we argue, not just a matter of personality or background or family. These are skills that can be practiced and taught. There's good research on social emotional learning showing that students who learn these skills achieve more, on average 11 points on tests, than students who do not have this sort of training. So you'll see SEL, if you just search on Edutopia and SEL, you'll see our films about that. The technology, which I think many people, or most of you in the audience are familiar with, I like to talk about weapons of mass instruction now, making sure that every student has access to a digital device. Pixar in a Box, access to these sorts of online resources that are just amazing. Pixar in a Box was just launched about 2 months ago and shows how math and science relate to art and animation. If you're going to do toys, story, or cars or planes, the way you communicate to the software in creating this animation is through coding and through mathematics. So there you'll see, for instance, as it says here, environment modeling, explore how blades of grass in the film Brave were created using parabolic arcs. A young digital animator comes out and says, let's look at how we create a field of grass. Let's look at one leaf of grass. And if you look at a leaf of grass, it's kind of smaller at the top, and then there's a little curve, and then it's a little shorter at the bottom. So that curve is a parabola. What is the equation for a parabola? They give it to you, and they look at the coefficients. We can make the blade of grass taller or shorter, fatter or thinner. This is how we're going to communicate to the computer to make us an entire field of grass. So immediately students are learning in middle school. This was intended for middle school students. Please use this with your middle school students. I'm sorry it's not yet in Korean. But they can understand some of this. We want to start middle school students understanding this connection between STEM and art. So again, to get ready for someday, if they're 10 years old, in another 15 years, they could be working at Pixar. I mentioned this project yesterday, closing the word gap, the 30 million word gap between rich and poor families. We've now have a digital solution where preschoolers wear a little digital device that records the language that they've heard. And this device produces reports for parents, tells them how many words. It's like a word pedometer. If you're trying to do 10,000 steps, how about hearing 10,000 positive words every day? It tells the parents how many words the child has heard, so when they get home at night, they can read to their child and have more interaction with that child. So early childhood education becomes very important. Another way in which we're beginning to quantify behavior and using that for data analysis in classrooms, a project by Victor Lee at Utah, where he has given students pedometers, and you see them running there. They're measuring their physical activity during recess, analyzing their data, and using the data to become more physically active over the course of a week. The edge of time and place, I think it's very important to have students in nature, being able to grow things. This is a project we featured called the Edible Schoolyard, where students grow plants and vegetables and learn to cook. It's called the Edible Schoolyard. It's a school garden that goes even further, and the students learn some culinary skills. It's the 100th anniversary of our national park system. And you'll see, if you want to go online and look at the centennial of the national parks, I'm sure many of you have visited, we have a project called Every Kid in a Park. We're trying to get, the president has talked about this, the first lady has talked about this, trying to get kids into nature and into national parks to understand our history, our culture, and the United States' most important landscapes, from the Grand Canyon and Yosemite to historic sites, Civil War battlefields, Japanese-American internment camps during World War II. That's a national park. So national parks are helping us confront our own history and telling us our multiple histories, not just the history that's in the textbook. Lastly, co-teaching and the largest edge of youth. I showed yesterday this film, a young boy who is teaching other students about 3D printing and design. He's able to design and print his own smartphone case with his name on the back. The Independent Project from high school students in Western Massachusetts. I understand you have something called the free semester, is that right? Where the students are not given tests. And this is an example of students then beginning to use that semester for their own independent work. During this semester, they write collections of short stories. They do citizen science. They go out and do service learning for their communities. So there's a nice film if you look up this project, the Independent Project. So I'll close with this. What is your definition of a great school, an innovative school? The key to this question is to make it short, maybe one sentence or two sentences, and how would you measure? What data would you collect to know if you had a great school? I was asked this question by a superintendent. He said, I see all these wonderful schools on your website. How would you define and measure a great school and do it in just a sentence or two? So I said, well, a great school has a community of students and parents and faculty. They're doing project-based learning. I basically, in these 30 minutes, I went on for about 10 minutes. He said, that's getting a little long. How would you measure that? I said, well, the tests don't measure everything. We need better assessments, more performance-based rather than memorization-based assessments. We're not there yet. And Paul Houston, the superintendent, said, okay, here is my definition of a great school. It's just one question. Do the children run in at the same rate they run out? You could measure this. This means that students are so eager to get to school, they're running into school. And when the school day is over, they're doing something, working together as a team, they don't want to leave. They're slower to leave. In many of the schools that we have featured, we've seen students tell their parents, could you wait for another 5 or 10 minutes while I finish my work with my classmate, with my team? That's the definition of a great school. So I hope that these comments have helped you think about creating more of these kinds of schools in Korea where students are running in as fast as they run out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chen, for your wonderful presentations. It's very informative and impressed for me. And especially I think he mentioned about 6 leading edges: thinking, curriculum and assessment, technology, time, place, co-teaching, co-learning, use, like these kinds of 6 leading edges for educational innovations are very useful for Korean education innovation in school. Maybe it's a globalization era, then it's almost the same problem and the same idea and strategy to innovate the school systems. Anyway, thank you very much. Once again, please give big hands, Mr. Chen. Then let's move to the second presentations. Our second speaker is Dr. Michael Teitelbaum. He is a senior research associate, Labor and Workforce Program, Harvard Law Schools. He will give us a very well-prepared presentation. Maybe you can get the PowerPoint materials from the homepage of the global HR forums. Then it's very easy, without any login, then just click the materials, then you can print out. Anyway, he will give us a very well-prepared presentation. The title of his presentation is there a global race for scarce scientific talents? Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Teitelbaum with the big hands.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I was thinking, as I was listening to Dr. Chen, that it would be very nice if I could figure out a way to produce videos, 4-minute videos on the topic I'm about to speak about, except they would not be as interesting because they would not have 5-year-old enthusiastic children raising their hands and they wouldn't be smiling in the same way. I've been asked to talk about the so-called global race for scientific talent that is scarce in the world, and I'm going to raise a few questions about this and ask if there is such a global race for scarce scientific talent, should there be? And the book on this slide is the origin of part of this presentation. It's a book I wrote or published last year about the claims that the United States science and engineering enterprise is falling behind the rest of the world. You notice the title is Falling Behind, but there's a large yellow question mark following that phrase. So what is the global race for talent? Well, it is a common argument that I'm sure all of you have heard, that national prosperity and indeed the future of all nations, their security, is now based on the knowledge economy, which is driven by science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the so-called STEM fields. And there's a global shortage of this talent. So governments should, in this argument, attempt to increase, in fact, to maximize the number of STEM professionals, if you will, that reside in their country. They should encourage domestic students to pursue degrees in these fields, and they should do their best to attract and to retain international students and immigrants. This is an example from McKinsey. They've had publications, what they call the war for talent. I prefer race. I don't like war, but it's the same concept, and they've been doing these kinds of reports since 1997. Now, perspectives on this subject differ, and I've juxtaposed here a statement from the President of the United States, Barack Obama, on your left, with a photo. I don't know if you can read the President's statement. I'll read it quickly. I also hear from many business leaders who want to hire in the United States, but can't find workers with the right skills. Growing industries in science and technology have twice as many openings as we have workers who can do the job. And then on the right side of the screen, you'll see a man standing with a sign which is based upon signs that appeared during the Great Depression, but modified to the current age. It says, "I will code Java for food." So you can see that there are different perspectives on whether there are shortages of people with these skills. And here's an example of the same thing being expressed in Europe, what they call the STEM gap, or the skills gap. The STEM acronym is of interesting origin. It was coined by the National Science Foundation of the US in 2001, and it deals with education fields, not with occupations. So what people specialize in, science, technology fields, are included, but not what they're doing in their occupations. It was later extended to occupations, but there is actually no agreement about what occupations are in this category called STEM. And this leads to huge variations in estimates of how big the American STEM workforce is. Is it 5% of the workforce, which is what the National Science Foundation estimates it to be, or is it 20% of the US workforce, which is what the Brookings Institution, a paper from the Brookings Institution reported a couple of years ago. The important difference, you see it's a fourfold difference. The important difference is that the National Science Foundation definition says you have to have a first degree to be a scientist or an engineer. And the Brookings Institution includes people who tune up your car because they're using technology, carpenters because they're measuring things carefully so that the piece of wood they cut will fit, people without degrees, in other words. So they're including the entire skilled workforce in what they call STEM. So when you see STEM workforce or STEM occupation, or when somebody says that, ask them which classification they mean. I'm going to deal with science and engineering because it's much more clearly defined. It's a subset, the 5% instead of the 20%. And it requires at least a first degree in a field of science and engineering. So we can define the workforce in science and engineering by the education, the concentration, the degree earned, or the major in American terminology. There's still some ambiguities because the question is, what do we do with the social sciences? What do we do with psychology? And what do we do about people who have concentrated outside of science and engineering fields, but who are working in occupations that are highly technical, science and engineering? The first thing I want to say about this workforce is that it is critical to the future of all countries in the world, or at least all advanced societies in the world, and hopefully those that aspire to be advanced economies. It is the leading edge of innovation. It's the leading edge of economic growth. But surprise, it's very small. Of all the workforces in the world, it's in the range of 5 to 10% of the workforce, unless you include auto technicians in the STEM workforce. And the economic effects vary widely by the field in science and engineering. So psychology, if that's part of science and engineering, is different from electrical engineering or computer science. And it differs by levels of education. One very impressive comparison, if you look across countries, is how wildly they differ in the percent of first degrees produced in each country in science and engineering. And in particular, in Asia, they are very high, primarily due to the very high percentage in engineering, the E, but not in science. Science looks in these countries very similar to European countries, North American countries, but engineering looks very different. And this slide will show you that. You'll see the first column of numbers is the percent of first degrees in the natural sciences and engineering. You see China at 44% of first degrees. And South Korea is second at 36%. The US is at the bottom, 16%. But the main difference is in engineering, in the second column of numbers, in which China is 31% of its first degrees are in engineering, Korea is 24%, and the US is 4%. So the science part of it looks fairly consistent across this wide range of countries. The European countries are in the middle of that distribution, but engineering is very different, particularly in East Asia. And here are some trends that are comparative across many of these countries, and I think you can see without studying this graph very carefully that these first degrees in natural science and engineering over a 10-year period, they're rising a little bit, but they're very slowly rising, if at all, with one exception. China is rising very rapidly. You can see Korea in that graph towards the middle, the clump of graphs there. It's the dotted line. So, what about the claims of science and engineering shortages, scarce workforce, and a global race to find it? What would we look for if we wanted to objectively assess those claims? Standard indicators. We would look for rising wages, rising real wages, net of inflation. We would look for occupations that have above average growth in employment. And we would look for low or declining unemployment rates in these occupations. And the empirical studies that have been done in the US, I cite one here, done during a boom period in the US economy, a buoyant economy, 1992 to 97, during which employers of scientists and engineers were claiming loudly that they were experiencing shortages of personnel to hire. What they found was that there were only 7 of 68 occupations that were studied that could be defined as in shortage or in short supply. And only one of them was in science and engineering. It was mechanical engineering, not in information technology, where the employers were most concerned about this. Academic studies of this subject have shown a broad consensus. American researchers have been able to find no evidence of general science and engineering shortages in the US. I cite some authors there. There are some exceptions that should be cited too, and I'm citing them there. The second one, Carnevale, is talking actually about pre-first degree technicians, and he believes there are shortages of those in the US workforce, but not of people with degrees. The many think tanks that populate Washington diverge on this subject. The RAND Corporation, which is a very eminent think tank, has done 2 studies of this subject and has been unable to find any sign of shortages in science and engineering. The other 2 organizations at the bottom are both financed by the information technology industry, and they both have reported large shortages in information technology workforce. So you can make your own judgment, but I just want to make the point that there is not consensus among the think tank studies that have been done. But the claim that there are shortages prevails. It dominates American political discussions and media discussions. And why might this be so if the consensus among the academic researchers is there's no sign of these shortages in general terms, and if there's not a consensus among the think tanks? Well, the first is theory, economic theory. I won't go into this in the interest of time, but I just want to say that a lot of the problem here is that the theory that technical progress accounts for about half of economic growth over the long term, associated with the Nobel Prize winning studies by the MIT economist Robert Solow. That's very compelling research. That technological advance is very important, and you can see it, of course, in this country, in Korea, in a very visible way. But unfortunately, that kind of compelling economic theory has been combined with other theories, which I list there, to produce what Philip Martin at the University of California at Davis calls somewhat tongue-in-cheek, human capital mercantilism, or mercantilism if you speak British English. Now, you remember mercantilism or mercantilism was the dominant economic theory in Europe in the 16th to 18th centuries. And the policy conclusions were you should limit imports, you should expand your labor force and the skills of your labor force, you should encourage population growth, you should encourage in-migration, and you should limit the departure, the out-migration of skilled personnel, artisans in that case. Those theories prevailed for 200 years. They should not be dismissed as crazy, but they didn't work after they were predominant. And they were superseded over 200 years ago by classical economics and later by neoclassical economics associated with Adam Smith and Ricardo. So human capital mercantilism says that human capital is just as important as physical capital. But it rejects the limits on imports of mercantilism and the limits on outmigration of mercantilism. Its goal is to maximize human capital, and that means educate more domestic human capital and attract more and retain more from abroad. So if it doesn't sound familiar to you, you will recall I said that is the current prevalent view on the science and engineering workforce. But I think it's a simplistic extension of the literature because the literature does not support the idea of maximizing the science and engineering workforce. That's a supply side only notion that if you just increase the number of scientists, increase the number of engineers, you'll get more economic growth. And it forgets that there has to be demand for them. Somebody has to hire them, provide them with laboratories and with capital to do research. And if there isn't that demand, And if there aren't careers for them, that kind of supply side model will not work. The second reason is misunderstanding. Politicians, American politicians at least, I don't know about Korean politicians, and media misunderstand this subject fairly routinely. First, they believe the claims about there being prevalent science and engineering shortages. Second, they believe, although they don't articulate it this way, that if you just had more scientists and engineers, you would have greater economic growth. They focus on the supply side, education, visas, and forget about the demand side. And one reason they do that is because of the activities of interest groups who are very actively advocating these points of view. So I list 4 here. I'll do this very quickly. Employers, and their goal really, in general, is to expand the pool from which they can hire their workforce and limit increases in wages to skilled personnel. There is a whole global industry of offshoring information technology, and it's a successful business model, especially in India, with companies such as those I list here. And the Indian government, of course, is strongly supportive of this kind of advocacy. There's the higher education industry, if you will, whose goals are to increase the funding for research that comes from governments, increase enrollments of science and engineering students, particularly graduate students, and increase the enrollments of international students. And then there are immigration lawyers who are the beneficiaries if you have large numbers of visas that need to be processed. The outcome of this advocacy is that shortage claims, which are not supported by almost all of the research that's been done by academic researchers, those shortage claims prevail. They are the predominant view. They are successful politically, and they lead to government decisions to increase funding sharply if the claim is there's a shortage of people with these skills, which is a threat to the future of the country, and increase the number of visas, especially temporary visas, for the employers who want to hire them. But they may be damaging the longer term because the booms in government funding, which I describe in some detail in this book, in the American case, typically turn into busts. So you get a sharp increase in funding, everybody's happy for about 5 to 10 years, and then the government tires of the sharp increases in funding, or there's a financial stringency, and the funding stops rising or even declines, and you have a catastrophe on the part of those industries and on the part of the students who have been encouraged to study in these fields. They have been overproduced relative to the demand for them in the economy. And that the effect of that is to discourage talented students who have options to go to other fields than science and engineering. And so you get these oscillations in the system in a long-term enterprise called research. Research is very long-term. Oscillations are very unhealthy for a long-term system. There have been 5 cycles in which alarms have been sounded about shortages of scientists and engineers in the United States, followed by booms, government funding booms, typically, followed by major busts since World War II alone. And I outlined them here. The first was immediately after the war until 1957, a lot of money put into physics. And then the money was getting tighter and much harder to get. It looked as if there was going to be a bust. But happily, or unhappily, the Russians launched Sputnik 1 in 1957, which aborted the bust that was incipient in the system and led to a second round of boom and bust from 1957 to the 1970s after Sputnik. The unfortunate thing that led to the bust was that NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which had been charged by President Kennedy with landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth within a decade, they succeeded in 1969. The huge amounts of money and personnel that were thrown into that crash project, the enthusiasm for those declined, and all of a sudden there was a bust during the 1970s. Round three in the US was the 1980s, essentially, and that was the military buildup led by President Reagan. And round four was not government-led, it was industry-led, and it was a 10-year boom in new industries such as the internet, which had not really been visible until the early 90s. It was around but hadn't been available. Telecommunications, fiber optics, big boom in those sectors, and information technology, all of which bust in 2001, and there was a period of 5 to 7 years of terrible circumstances with massive layoffs in previously booming areas like Silicon Valley. And finally, round five was a government-induced boom and bust with the doubling of research funding in 5 years by the American government to the National Institutes of Health, which then flattened out and it continues to be flat. So what do we know? I put in red here, we have no credible empirical evidence of general shortages of scientists and engineers. Lots of variation by field, over time, place, degree level. You can find simultaneously shortages of one kind of scientist or engineer and surpluses of other kinds of scientists and engineers. You can find shortages in Silicon Valley and surpluses in other parts of the country. Second thing we know is that most science and engineering careers are not in academe. They are outside of academe. But we know the graduate degrees, the American graduate degrees, still focus on the academic goal of basic research. And finally, we know that shortages can look very much more threatening if you just project them out long enough into the future. So projections going out with optimistic assumptions about demand for scientists and engineers are the best way to make the case. I want to turn now quickly to efforts to link science and engineering graduate degrees to the workplace. I took out some slides that I had previously prepared because I found a common theme running through these meetings of interest in linking of education to the workplace at all levels, including, I guess, even 5-year-olds. And I want to take you to the upper tier, the 5%, if you will, of scientists and engineers in the workforce, and show you that there are experiments underway to link highly educated scientists and engineers, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, to the workplace in ways that have not been successful before. And I'm going to quickly talk about these three. The first is the University of California in San Francisco, which is one of the premier biomedical research universities in the world, which, because of the problems of its PhD candidates and its postdocs in finding career paths, because the labor market is not demanding as many as are being produced, has started a program called the Graduate Student Internships for Career Exploration, in which graduate students do internships outside of academe. Does this sound familiar in terms of some of the other discussions at this conference? I think so. But it's being done at the PhD and postdoc level in this case. It's available to all basic biomedical graduate programs. The internships are full-time and last 3 months during one academic quarter. The second example, this one run by the National Institutes of Health, is called the BEST program, and it seeks to do the same things using grants to other institutions. I think actually the University of California at San Francisco program, which had started before the BEST program was announced, did win one of the awards to support their efforts. And the third is the Professional Science Master's Degree program, which is very new by higher education standards, and I want to give you a few bits of information about this. These degrees are new degrees, meaning they started, the first graduates were 10 or 12 years ago, and they're hybrid degrees. They're master's degrees, 2-year degrees, in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, but they combine with the T-shape, you remember people talking about the T-shaped person, they combine that deep knowledge of the field of science or technology with a broad knowledge, the T, at the top of the T, in skills that are necessary to be successful outside of the academic occupations. So in large companies, in small companies, in government agencies and institutes. These skills, which are summarized here as plus skills, are business skills, communication skills, teamwork, project management, presentation, regulatory issues for fields like pharmaceutical research, where regulators are very important to understand, intellectual property law, patents, that sort of thing, how to manage financially. So these are the skills that any corporate employer is looking for in its employees. They want the technical skills, they want the scientific and engineering skills, but they want more than that. They want these broader skills that allow people to function in the way that large corporations do in this field. Here's a graph of the growth of professional science master's degrees. You see it was effectively zero less than 20 years ago. It showed sustained growth but slow growth until about 2008. And then you can see in the graph, it's fairly obvious, there was a point of inflection in which the growth of these degree programs went sharply upward and continues to go upward very rapidly. So now there are 342 such degree programs in American and Canadian universities at 159 universities. These degrees are being developed in other countries, and including in Korea. I list the Ulsan National Institute of Science and Technology, which I know has 2 of these degrees that have been certified as meeting the criteria. And if you want information about these degrees, I put the website up there for you to have a look at. The American Chronicle of Higher Education, which is sort of the newspaper of higher education, put this headline on its recent story about these degrees. And I do think they're right in saying that it has been unusually successful. By the standards of American, and I think probably Korean, and certainly European higher education, this kind of innovation and the speed of its adoption by higher education institutions is quite astonishing. 15 years to go from 0 to 300 and what was the number? 342 degree programs at 159 universities. That is a very rapid pace indeed. So just to conclude, I think what's needed in discussions of the global race for scarce talent or the shortages of scientists and engineers, whatever you want to call it, is some balance and some objectivity. Shortages of scientists and engineers should be avoided because, as I said earlier, they are the engine of economic advance in all advanced countries. But it's also important to avoid surpluses. That's a terrible waste of talent to train somebody, educate somebody for 5 to 10 years, and then find they cannot find a career path in the field in which they have studied to become a professional. And the effect of that, as we've seen in the American booms and busts, is to discourage the very talented students who you would like to enter these fields going into the future, to discourage them from entering. And that leads to another kind of boom and bust cycle in terms of interest of talented students. So the goals, I think, should be not to claim shortages that probably don't exist or to claim surpluses that also probably don't exist, but to balance the supply of this talent with effective demand. And that means you need to have more communication between science and technology education with employers who know what they're looking for going forward, so that the educators are aware of what the changing needs are of the primary employer sector for scientists and engineers, which is not universities. It's primarily industry and government. And finally, one of the effects of doing it that way is to ensure that the careers are attractive and competitive with other possible careers that talented young people can pursue. You want them to pursue them, and one way to make sure they will continue to pursue them is to ensure that they don't think they're going to be dumped onto the unemployment lines or be unable to start their career when they finish their degree. So it's very important to maintain that balance. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to talk about any questions.
And thank you very much for your informative presentations. Especially from your presentation, I realized the balance and objectivity is very important for educational development as well as economic development, as well as I think the sustainable development. Yeah, from now on, we will have about 20 minutes Q&A sessions. We received about 8 questions, but sometimes it's very difficult to read because it's handwriting. So, yeah, there is maybe the first question is to Dr. Chen is like this. Does Edtopia also have a project-based set of programs and videos tailored for children with special needs, mentally challenged children? What is the working formula for the education of these children?
Thanks for that question. I would say we need more of that, but we do have a fair amount of content about how to work with children with special needs, especially around the potential of what we call assistive technology. Ways in which technology is enabling students who might have what was formerly thought to be a disability, a physical disability. Children who might be blind can now hear their text read thanks to technology. So we've always been a big advocate for assistive technology and for really broadening the definition of special needs. Mr. Lucas is quite progressive in this approach. He has a wonderful statement that when you think about it, we all have special needs. All of us have strengths and weaknesses and things. When I talked about the multiple intelligences, things that we're better at, things that we're not as good at, and we can find ways to improve, and technology is really showing some amazing capabilities to help students with disabilities and special needs. So you see a fair amount of content on our website about that.
Yeah, once again, it's for Dr. Chen. I totally agree that emotional, actional-based learning, like a pixel in a box, can offer interest to students, but it is already done in many elementary schools, and I think it only applies for early level of educational fields. Is it possible to apply even in high-level academic fields?
You mean emotional intelligence or pixel?
Yeah, pixel in a box or emotional and action-based learning, like a pixel in a box. Yeah,
if I understand the question correctly, absolutely. And the higher level academic fields, many of the things that I mentioned, when you think about, if you want to consider university training, postgraduate training, yes, many companies are saying we need graduates who can do these same sorts of skills, work together in a team, carry out project-based learning. So many of the things I showed that relate to younger students can certainly apply to older students, and especially those, as you suggest, at higher levels of academic learning. We have a big job to do to close this gap between university training and the workforce. So one project I'd like to mention that starts in the high school, actually, in California is called linked learning. You can look it up on the web, linked learning, sometimes called multiple pathways. When California, especially the Irvine Foundation, we have a wonderful tradition in the US of foundations, and Michael worked at the Sloan Foundation, doing the research and taking on more innovative and some would say more risky kinds of innovation, doing the work that it takes to prove a concept, and then if it's successful, having the government take it over and say, we want to now spread this and scale this. So in California, the foundation, the Irvine Foundation, was looking to improve the California high school experience. We have a lot of high school students who are very disengaged and dropping out of high school. We have a very high dropout rate. And they found different examples and projects, but no comprehensive approach. They said, well, we're going to have to start a comprehensive approach to this, to linked learning and multiple pathways. And they said one of the key ingredients is for high school students to have more exposure to the workplace. You can go through high school in many high schools and not have any idea what goes on in careers. Once in a while, a professional might come in and talk about their career. The idea of linked learning is to get students into internships, into the workplace, in healthcare, in architecture, in legal fields. They identified 7 or 8 different fields of vital importance to California's economy, including digital entertainment. California's great export is music, films, television around the world. So how can we get high school students to see that pathway from being 16 years old and wanting to work at Pixar? So Pixar in a Box is one example, and linked learning is really trying to do that as well.
Yeah, thank you. Next question is to Dr. Teitelbaum. It looks like very personal questions. What is the reason? Why did you conduct research on science talents? Why did you do this kind of research on science talents?
Well, scientific talent is the future of all advanced countries. The quality of the science, the quality of the technology, the quality of the engineering, and of course it feeds back, as Dr. Chen says, into the quality of the early education for the students of that country. If the technology is very strong and the science is very strong, they're very constructive feedback loops. So I think anyone who's interested in the future welfare of the Korean population, say, if any of you are, would be interested in the quality of scientific personnel in Korea, of engineers in Korea, and of the career paths for them, available for them. It disturbed me a bit, I must say, in this forum to hear that one of the more recent problems in Korea, which has been a spectacular economic and political success story over the past decades, is that increasingly, it was said by quite a few speakers, increasingly well-educated young Koreans with degrees from high-quality universities are finding it difficult to initiate stable and successful careers. That should worry people in Korea, as it does in many other countries. And you just have to be careful that you don't take the mantra of education is good, so more education is better, and more PhDs are better than fewer. If you take that too far, you will find fewer people with talent interested in going into these fields. They have to have some reasonable assurance of a career path when they finish. And I just wanted to follow up on Dr. Chen's comments earlier. He mentioned some very eminent people like George Lucas had not done well in school. I can name a couple of others that I think you will have heard of. Steve Jobs, for example, dropped out of the college that I went to. He found it boring. I found it interesting, but he found it boring, and he dropped out after his first year. He did, however, learn about calligraphy when he was at this college in Oregon called Reed College. He learned about calligraphy, and I don't know if you noticed, but one of the advantages of the Macintosh computer was calligraphy. He built calligraphy into the Macintosh design. Previously, computers did block capital letters on green screens. I don't know if any of you have ever seen those old cathode ray screens. He asked his engineers, why do we always have block capital letters? And the answer was, well, because they're the most efficient in terms of random access memory, RAM. And he said, well, we won't have any limitations of RAM in the Macintosh. I want to see calligraphy. Come back to me with fonts that are beautiful. And they said, what is calligraphy? They were engineers. They didn't know what calligraphy was. So this is a perfect example of the intersection, I think, between art, and in this case, history, with technology, information technology, computer science, which actually made a lot of the reputation of Apple computing, were the beautiful fonts that were made available first in an Apple computer.
Okay, thank you. These questions also go to Dr. Teitelbaum. Actually, he or she is high school students. What do you think is the cause of science and engineering stories? Why do students avoid science and engineering fields? How can we solve this problem?
Is the questioner saying why should they avoid? I don't think they should avoid. I think it's a very exciting career path for talented young people to pursue. And the more students who don't wish to be engineers or scientists, the more they understand about science and engineering and technology, the better they will do in the future in any career path they decide to follow. So I think we should not discourage, we should encourage them, but we shouldn't tell them that there is a shortage of people with these qualifications, because if there isn't, they will find themselves disappointed when they finish their studies and are unable to find an attractive career path. We should tell them it's an important set of skills and knowledge that everyone in the 21st century should have, no matter what they want to do, including art.
Okay, thank you. And this question to Dr. Chen. It says, I am a high school student. It's quite a hard task for me to teach fellow students about any topics. What can be a solution for students who do not like to actively participate or are not well skilled during the instruction?
As Michael was saying, some of the skills we want the 21st century managers to know about in any field is this ability to present and to teach in that sense. So while you're in high school, you can get some practice in this. We once did a project with middle school students around the early days of the Macintosh. I love Michael's story about Steve Jobs. Please check out Steve Jobs' commencement speech at Stanford, one of the most moving and valuable commencement speeches ever given, in which he talks about how he came to Reed College and what he learned there. But this ability to share information, we once did a project in middle schools where we just took the whiteboard and put a line down the middle. And on one side we had the students write what I know and can teach, and on the other side we put what I would like to learn. It became a learning exchange. Everyone put down something they could teach, everyone put down something they could learn. This was about the use of technology, use of the Macintosh, back in the day, hypercard stacks. I don't think many of the young people will remember this. It's kind of like the dark room. So that's a good practice. You can learn to do this if your schools and maybe your after-school programs encourage you to exchange information, share information. It is a very valuable skill, the ability to teach and present and learn from others.
Yeah, I would add that all students who do projects, whether they be individual projects or team projects, should be encouraged or perhaps even required to present those projects to their fellow students and their teacher in an oral form with slides or whatever appropriate audiovisuals. It's a discipline to their thinking, and if they can't explain, if they don't learn to explain what they've done to people who have not done it, they will be somewhat limited in their ability to work in large organizations like companies, corporations, where every day you have to explain to your colleagues or to your management what you are doing, why it's important for the project or for the company, why does it justify the investment of the company's assets, its capital in this project. It's a very important set of skills, these communication skills, and they should be taught actively, and they should be exercised in team projects or individual projects as the culmination of the project.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, another questions to Dr. Chen. In your presentation, you were focusing on the new innovative form of learning and teaching. I believe that we need excellent and innovative thinking mindset teachers who can achieve the 21st innovative education for children and students. Any suggestions to train teachers who have new innovative mindset for future education? Wow, it's a wonderful question, I think.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for asking that. And so much of this does depend on a new role for teachers, as I was suggesting. Teachers can also be learners. Learners can also be teachers. This should be part of everyone's identity, to be able to teach and to be able to learn. This great saying that one of the best ways to learn something is to teach it. When you try to teach something, you very quickly learn what areas you didn't quite understand, so you begin to improve those areas. And as far as this question is concerned, we have a long ways to go to improve our teacher preparation in the U.S. I don't know the situation here in Korea as well. Often these innovative programs reach a limit, bump into a wall of the way in which teachers are prepared. So we very much want to have more of these ideas used in courses where teachers are learning what it's like to be a teacher, to have these kinds of mindsets and models in their minds as they go out teaching. So we like it very much when schools of education begin to incorporate our materials in their courses, and we're trying to improve that as well.
Yeah, thank you. I have two more questions to Dr. Teitelbaum. This also is the high school students. Yeah, Korean high school students have a lot of questions, but usually, doctors, teachers, and professors almost no questions. It's very amazing phenomenon. Anyway, starting from 2018, Korean high school students get an integrated education. It is a great part to meet the social ones. growing integrated human resources. However, it provokes worries that it would make students avoid science and engineering field even more. What would be the solution to help students not to lose interest in science and engineering fields and maintain their deepened study?
Well, I tried to say earlier that I think a knowledge of science and engineering and mathematics are central to being an educated person in this century. If you don't understand science, mathematics, technology, you will be at a great disadvantage in a century that is already dominated and will be more dominated, I think, by those fields. So whatever you want to be, I don't know which student asked this question, but whatever you think you might want to be, your ability to be that kind of person will be greatly enhanced if you study and learn as much as you can about science, engineering, mathematics. You will be surprised how many ways it will be helpful to you. So it is a mistake, I think, to say, well, I'm really interested in art or modern dance, so why do I have to work hard to understand the calculus? That is a mistake. You should learn calculus, whatever you want to be. You should, it will come in useful no matter what you end up doing, and of course nobody knows what people who do modern dance will be doing in 15 years. It will be new, it'll be different. So I would say anyone who wishes to be considered educated in this century needs to include a strong set of understandings of these fields.
I just add a comment that Michael mentioned the notion of the T learner. I hope you've heard that in several sessions. We've been trying to emphasize it, but that's what you want. And that means across the top of the T, even though you might want to become an artist or a journalist or a writer or a scientist, across the top of the T, you don't ignore the other subject areas. And Stanford is one of the most selective universities. When they're asked, you only accept 1 out of every 20 applications, and you reject students with perfect grades. You reject students with perfect test scores. You know how hard that is, perfect grade. You reject students with both perfect grades and perfect test scores. So people say, what are you looking for? And Stanford has figured out we want the T-shaped student. We want students who, if they're interested in science, they never say, I'm not an art person. They're interested in art. If you take a science person, you say, you want to go to an art museum? They don't say, no, I'm not interested. They say, I'd like to go. Maybe I can learn something. If you take an artist or a dancer and you say, do you want to learn some science? They don't say, I don't do science. They said, I'm interested in that. I'm intellectually curious about everything. That's what they want.
Yeah, this is the last questions, but not to Dr. Teitelbaum. It's also high school kids. I would like to ask you about the growing interest in liberal arts in Korea. Nowadays, liberal arts is getting more and more interest along with the growing demands on STEM subjects. How do you see this comparativity of these two rather opposite fields of academia? Just like the STEM subject, do you think liberal arts will go through boom and bust in the terms of its demands?
To the last question, yes. I think it will go through booms and busts, but someone who is broadly educated as well as deeply educated in a field of special interest will be much more capable of adapting to the circumstances they find themselves in than someone who is narrowly educated, because then it's just the luck of the draw. If your field goes through a bust, you don't have any other skills or knowledge or capacity to adjust. But if you do know how what you know in depth might be relevant to other domains, because you understand those domains, you're much more able to adapt to changing circumstances that will surely find you. As Steve Jobs said in that famous Stanford commencement address, which you should, as Dr. Chen said, it's online, you should watch it. It's very interesting. He started out by saying to these perhaps somewhat arrogant Stanford graduates,
Yes.
he said, I have one message for you. You will fail. And the key to how you do with your life is how you will fail. The key is how you will respond to your failure and how you will adapt and change what you're doing in order to succeed. And then he went through his 3 main failures, which I won't try to describe to you. But the general point is the more breadth of knowledge you have, as well as depth, the better positioned you are for these unpredictable cycles of boom and bust. The last thing I want to say is I am increasingly confused by the term liberal arts. I went to a liberal arts college, Reed College, where Jobs went. That did not mean that science and engineering and mathematics were not important. They were very important in that college. They were part of the liberal arts. So everyone who wanted to be a history major had to understand physics and chemistry and math. That's what was meant by liberal arts. I'm now hearing that phrase used to mean not science, not mathematics, not, I don't mean here, but I've heard it used this way. It's not really what it means. It means liberal, meaning very broad, well-educated with breadth. And in order to be well-educated, as I said earlier, I think you have to be educated in science and mathematics.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's time, it is almost time to finish. Once again, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation as well as your very kind answers. Please give them big hands.